Hello, Dana.
Hello.
How's it going?
I'm great. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, me too. So, hi, everybody. I'm Alexis Baden-Mayer, Political Director of the Organic Consumers Association. And today I have the great pleasure of talking with Dana Perls. She is a food and agriculture campaigner at Friends of the Earth. And she and I have worked together a lot in the past on GMO issues related to our Millions Against Monsanto campaign. And today we're going to discuss an issue local to California, Berkeley, California, where Bayer, which bought Monsanto in 2018, has an enormous facility. It's like 32 acres, right? Right in the middle of Berkeley, California.
That's right.
Yeah, so they want to expand that quite a bit. And they want an agreement with the city of Berkeley about how they can continue operations in an expanded way in the city. And the residents of Berkeley are a little bit concerned. So, Dana, what are Berkeley residents concerned about at this point with Bear expanding?
People are very concerned about the health and safety of the residential neighborhood. The facility will be right in the middle of where residents live, and it's also located right on the bay that leads out into the Pacific Ocean. So there's also concerns about environmental safety. What happens inside of the lab? How are the local residents being protected? There's concern about worker protection as well. And the lack of transparency about both what is happening inside the lab and what are the biosafety lab proactive protections and what are some of the problems. There's no transparency between the lab and the city, and there are very weak regulations between the lab and the federal authorities.
Yeah, so apparently there were a few very reasonable asks that Berkeley residents wanted from the city. And the city, has so much power at this point. Like Berkeley or Bear will expand in Berkeley or they won't. And it seems like this is the ideal time for the city to step up and get some concessions, but they couldn't even get concessions on sharing what sort of research would be done at the facility, right?
That's right. So the Bayer lab was approved, and the development agreement was approved for another 30 years. And Bayer paid the city of Berkeley $33.1 million to do its expansion. There were quite a number of both residents of Berkeley, but also experts, biosafety experts from around the country that approached Berkeley in hopes of getting certain safeguards for public health and the environment into the development agreement. Amongst that was essentially an agreement to increase transparency around what's happening in the lab and what's being done to protect worker and residential public health and what was being done to protect the environment. Part of that call was for all of the reports that are submitted to federal agencies to also be submitted to local Berkeley agencies. And so we weren't asking for anything new, but that at the local level, we could also see any reports of accidents, understand what those biosafety standards are, and give Berkeley the opportunity to decide whether that's enough to protect its residents. That was not agreed upon. And in fact, both the city and Bayer pushed back on that need for transparency. There were two major asks about the research. One, given that we're in the midst of COVID, where we have all these questions about pathogens and the spread of pathogens amongst populations, we asked that there not be any pathogen enhancement research. And so that would be research looking at a virus to increase its pathogenicities, right? So to see how high you can take a virus or a pathogen. And essentially, if that pathogen were to escape the lab, that would put the communities at risk. And as we saw with COVID, it's not just the surrounding Berkeley residents, but it could put communities much broader at risk. So the ask was within these labs to not do what we call gain of function research, where you enhance pathogens. The second ask was to not do any research where you would essentially create the precursors to genetically engineered humans. And those were the various asks. We also had asks about keeping the lab levels to lab level 1 and 2, which are lab levels for certain types of research that are going to be less risky in comparison to a level 3 or 4. And there were some verbal commitments, but none of these agreements, no, we're not going to do gain of function research, we're not going to develop GE humans, we're going to stay to level 1 and 2, but none of that at the end was written into the development agreement, which is what the Berkeley residents were insisting, because a lot can happen over the course of 30 years. And what somebody says on a webinar 30 years ago may not be remembered anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard to imagine how genetic engineering might advance over 30 years, considering how far we've come over the last 30 years. Yeah. So what are, yeah, what are your thoughts about that? I haven't found any information about Bayer being involved in human genetic engineering, but what they are big on is gene therapy. And the COVID vaccines can be considered gene therapy in a way, or at least they're the same technology using mRNA to deliver instructions to the cell to operate differently than the cell would normally operate. Do you have more in-depth information on what Bayer might be doing?
I think that it's a massive campus, and what Bayer is doing right now is going to change over the next couple of years. It's going to change certainly over the next 30 years. And as medicine develops and as genetic engineering tools are applied more and more, we want to make sure that when Berkeley apologized years ago for its role in eugenics, then we need to make sure that that also includes what we call techno-eugenics, when you use genetic engineering tools in attempts to alter or control the outcomes of a human, the DNA of a human, with these lofty ideas that we're going to, have a human with only blue eyes, or with a certain personality, or certain intelligent genes or athletic genes. Maybe right now they're speaking about using different genetic engineering technologies to engineer humans in order to address very complicated diseases. Not only is that not working or not happening, but we're also seeing pharmaceuticals get into other conversations where it edges on, how much is it ethically okay to engineer humans, and what are the impacts on a person's body now and into the future. We just don't know enough to be able to do it safely, and certainly there's too many ethical questions to dive into it. So it's because Bayer doesn't know what it's going to work on for the next 30 years, it's really essential to put guardrails. And even more so, it's really critical, even if Berkeley can't dictate what a lab does or doesn't do, if Berkeley decides not to say, here's what you can and can't do, at a minimum, Berkeley needs to know. The city, any city where there's a biolab, needs to know what is happening inside, and what are the biosafety protocols, what are the plans, what's the research activity, is the lab following best practices, what are all the other safety measures, and we need to know what those safety measures are, and they need to be the highest standards, not just following the standards of our federal agencies, but following the standards of some of the best labs in the country, and based on the research that's happening inside. Currently, city planners historically focus on height and parking and traffic and housing and environmental impacts, but we haven't really dove into what it would look like to have biosafety standards at such a massive scale for these labs. Bayer is just one example of a campus. We recently residents and experts from around the country wrote a follow-up letter to the city of Berkeley raising concern about a number of labs, biolabs, that are going to be proposed or are proposed for the city of Berkeley. So it's not just Bayer, it's not just UC Berkeley, it's not just Lawrence Berkeley Labs, but we're starting to see a whole pipeline of biolabs make proposals for everything from genetically engineered algae to produce food or biofuels to pharmaceuticals. And so as we're seeing more and more labs want to do different levels of risky research, it's really important that we have safety protocol so that we know that genetically engineered algae isn't going to leave out of the air vents and contaminate our bay and the ocean, so that we know that whatever pathogen research is happening isn't going to accidentally impact some of the workers or the residents. Really, we need to have transparency. It's the most important piece, and that's the piece that we don't have right now.
Yeah, it was a very reasonable request to just get the documents sent to the federal government. In the Intercept article about this controversy, one of the things that was mentioned is that this is a BSL-2, a biosafety level 2 lab, and that's actually where most accidents happen because the safety standards are less and there aren't as many protocols that the researchers have to go through. I believe the example mentioned in the article was that someone who was researching in a BSL-2 lab contracted plague and died from plague. So that would have to be one of these things reported to the federal government. And yet, if this happened at the Bayer lab in Berkeley, if someone was working with a pathogen and in this BSL-2 level and contracted the pathogen, if they got exposed to it and even died from it, and then had to report that to the federal government, that's information that the city of Berkeley wouldn't be getting. The thing is completely opaque.
At least not in a very timely fashion. Not only is it important for the city of Berkeley to know what's happening in the labs, when it's happening, and have yearly reports, but it's also important that the city have a specialized committee to review those documents.
Yeah.
And that needs to be a very carefully chosen committee so that it's not only just, a committee of people from the labs, but also independent experts, ecologists, ethicists, to really be who know what to look for and to know what the concerns are and what to flag. It's really it's dangerous. It sets a bad precedent, and it sets a precedent for companies really having the upper hand in deciding what's allowed and not allowed.
Yeah, definitely. I was really impressed by the coalition that you all formed in Berkeley around this. There are a lot of interesting groups with very prestigious scientists and ethicists and experts who would be ideal for a committee like this. It seems like Berkeley has these human resources to really do the right thing here. You should tell us a little bit about Friends of the Earth's partners on this campaign. I was really impressed.
Yeah, we're working with a very wide group of people, ranging from the Center for Genetics and Society and the Alliance for Humane Biotechnology, groups who have worked on biosafety issues for very many years in their universities, groups who haven't worked on it but understand the risks of genetic engineering. I think particularly over the past couple of years in the pandemic, it becomes clear that an accident or something that evolves in one part of the world can have devastating effects on everyone. I think it's also been clear that these developments in genetic engineering, which are very investor driven and also which have a lot of alarming science naming all sorts of unintended consequences from genetic engineering of simple organisms like algae or yeast, let alone a plant like corn, let alone an animal like salmon or
Mhm.
human, right? As we
Mhm.
get more complex, the more surprises that we see, and the more scientists are understanding how little we can predict or control genetics, DNA, or even understand how complex beings really function.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a lot of people who are concerned about the safety of people, the safety of the environment. I mean, really, it's something everybody's concerned about. I think that where we get to a conflict for a city is the balance between a city that may be pro-development in general and not wanting to lose, you know, $33.1 million from Bayer, but
Right.
also wanting to set the highest bar of any place in the country of what biosafety standards should look like.
Mhm.
And there may be other cities that don't set those standards. And so it's a choice that a city needs to make between protecting its residents, protecting the environment, protecting its workers, um, or having these developments. Ideally you have both. Like
Mhm.
if you're going to have a lab, that there's responsible safeguards. And the problem with level biosafety level 2, as you said, is there's a real gray zone as to what, like, where does biosafety level 2 stop and level 3 start. So there's a gray zone in terms of what can happen. And just because a lab starts out at a certain level, it's very common later to send a petition and say, we have been level 2. We'd like to do this research, and we're applying for a permit to change.
Right.
And if there's nothing in the development agreement that addresses that, it makes it all the more difficult to address it later. And it might not be something that's publicly released. It may not require public comment.
Mhm.
So we really want to see the community involved, and not just for Bayer and their lab, which was just approved with the development agreement, but with the future of all the biotech labs that are coming online.
Yeah, it's interesting. Communities around the country are all grappling with this. In Boston, it became a huge deal when Needle came in. That was their first biosafety level 4 lab in Boston, and that was a major concern. And a similar fight when the USDA lab at Plum Island, another biosafety level 4 lab, relocated to Manhattan, Kansas. Plum Island, they were out at Plum Island because that was considered kind of out of the way. It's an actual island. The lab was the only thing on that island. And now some people are concerned that pathogens have escaped from Plum Island. That's one theory about how Lyme disease. Um, Lyme, Connecticut is just right across the water from Plum Island. So it may be that even situating something on an island doesn't ensure perfect safety if you aren't using the best standards. I've read some books about Plum Island, and they were working with animals, and they did not have good safety standards. There were a lot of scandals that were exposed about how Plum Island was handling animals, and then it was really no surprise that pathogens could escape from that type of scenario because they had animals in the lab, animals outdoors, animals interacting with wild animals. You could deer would actually it was really close to the shore. So deer were swimming back and forth between Plum Island and Connecticut. And so, the idea that they could totally contain the animal experiments that they were doing on Plum Island was probably, you know, a not well thought out idea. But now they've situated the new Plum Island, the new USDA facility, right in the middle of Manhattan, Kansas, which is very much like Berkeley. It's a college town. There are a lot of industry labs set up around the college, and yeah, it's right there in the middle of town. And then if they have animal experiments, that could impact the agricultural regions that are around the town. It's amazing when you start looking into the history of lab accidents, like the very last, SARS one, uh, back in 2002, 2003. It petered out pretty quickly. It wasn't like COVID in any way, there were about 800 deaths around the world, and then the virus kind of just burnt itself out. And then the last cases known of SARS were laboratory cases where people who were working on treatments or vaccines for SARS ended up getting SARS. And those were the last known cases. So at a certain point, you have to see these labs as vectors in some way. I mean, even federal regulators commenting on that scenario said, well, that just shows the importance of making sure we have a SARS vaccine available for lab workers because they might get SARS. So if we're thinking of that we only can protect lab workers through, pharmaceutical interventions, then we don't have a very good biosafety system set up because, yeah, I mean, I guess the reality of this is that none of these labs are totally perfect, and we have to expect that there will be accidents. So I think that, yeah, the campaigners' idea of having some transparency there and having the community informed when there are lab accidents or when there are experiments that are so risky that they have to be approved by federal regulators, like that's just the basics. Yeah.
Yeah, we just want to know, we know what some of the best practices are for protecting worker safety and community public health. And we know what some of the best practices are for protecting the environment outside around labs and what those safety measures need to be. And so if we know what the research is, then the city can ensure that those labs are matching their safety protocols with the research that's happening on the inside. And so we want to protect communities and we want to protect the environment.
Absolutely. Well, you'll have to keep us updated as this situation unfolds. I didn't really realize that it wasn't just about the Bayer expansion, that there were new labs. It's kind of becoming like the equivalent for the pharmaceutical industry of Silicon Valley. And maybe because there is so much overlap now between Silicon Valley and the pharmaceutical industry, having biolabs situated on the Berkeley or near the Berkeley campus and near San Francisco, it's probably going to be a hot spot. So yeah, it would be really good if they could get regulated. Anything more that we should know about this situation? I'm dying to ask you about some other Friends of the Earth campaigns, but anything else we should know about the Berkeley Bayer Biolabs situation?
No, I think if people want to get involved, if folks have things to say or have expertise on this or want to support, they can get in touch with me at Friends of the Earth. It's just my first initial and last name, dperls@foe.org. And so anybody who wants to learn more or to weigh in, to participate in city council meetings, to write letters, etc., I'd be happy to help that. But I'm happy to move on.
Yeah, well, everybody get this video to your friends in Berkeley. Anybody who you know who lives in that area, they really need to know about this. So yeah, so right before we went on, I was starting to get a little bit of an update from you, Dana, on what's happening with genetically modified mosquitoes. So they've already been released in Florida. Is that the case?
That's right. Last year, the EPA, federal EPA, approved the release of millions of genetically engineered mosquitoes into the Florida Keys. And they did 1 year of releases, one mosquito season of releases. And the EPA recently approved another 2 years in Florida, as well as 2 years in California. So the preparation for releasing another round in Florida Keys has begun. And it's unclear as to whether or not the genetically engineered mosquitoes have been released yet, or if they're doing other types of research. Again, the level of transparency, similar to the biolabs, the transparency around this genetically engineered mosquito experiment, which is run by Oxitec. It's a British biotech company, so run out of the UK. Doing its experiments in Florida, and it wants to do its experiments in California. There has not been a decision yet in California. The company has proposed doing these trials, experiments in Tulare County, which is in California's agricultural belt in the Central Valley. It's raised a whole lot of concerns and questions, including questions around race, because it's already a very heavily impacted community of farm workers by pesticides and valley pollution. There's also a number of concerns about the environmental impacts. People have not been consulted. There's very little education. And there hasn't been a decision yet, and that's because the community is speaking up against the project.
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, so there we got a lot of engagement once we started talking about the genetically modified mosquitoes. I think this is an issue that people are extremely concerned about. Someone in Florida, I guess, is saying they've been doing it for years here in South Florida. And then someone else said Zika was after one release. I've never heard that. Have you heard that there's a connection between Zika?
No, this mosquito is the Aedes aegypti, and the Aedes aegypti is very specifically supposed to look at dengue. Sorry for the noise. And there haven't been any cases of dengue or Zika, at least in California. There were a long time ago in Florida, but most of the cases are from travelers outside as opposed to mosquitoes from within. The releases in Florida have not been highly monitored. The company is in charge of monitoring its own genetically engineered mosquitoes, which raises a number of questions. There's also in California, we have very few Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, and we don't have any cases of dengue or Zika in California. The couple of cases that have existed in the past, again, were travelers who contracted it outside the US, but there hasn't been any from in the US. So there is concern, though, that the genetically engineered mosquito will create more of a problem. There was independent research out of Yale from a professor who focused on the previous version of the mosquito and found that the mosquito populations went back up after a certain amount of time. And the research also found a number of questions about whether the hybrid mosquito that formed between wild Aedes aegypti and the genetically engineered mosquito may be more virulent, may be more aggressive, may be harder to kill with pesticides. And so there needs to be a bit more research, but also there's a lot of questions about whether or not this genetically engineered mosquito, A, probably won't work, and B, probably will create a problem that doesn't exist. And at a time where we're already seeing public health crises, we're already seeing the impacts of genetically engineered organisms spread through environments, we really need to have data. We need to do cage trials. There needs to be an expert scientific advisory panel. There are so many steps that were skipped. There were waivers given to certain tests. There's redacted information about allergenicity of what happens when a mosquito bites you. The company claims that no mosquitoes that are female will be released. And so there's a whole bunch of information that and tests and data that aren't being explored based on the company's promise that there won't be any female mosquitoes released. We don't know how it is. What is the process by which they're going to ensure that? If there is a 2 or 3% chance that females which bite are released into the environment, then what happens? There's no safety plan. There's no consent. There should be free and prior informed consent for community members who may not want to be part of this experiment. There's a bunch of missing data, which means that the EPA never should have approved this in the first place. There have been no independent studies of this genetically engineered version of this mosquito. So we're really just looking at company data, most of which is private. And at the same thing with the biolabs, we don't have regulations. There are no regulations at the federal level or at the state level specifically for genetically engineered insects. they are shoved in, shoehorned into this bucket as pesticides. But a chemical pesticide is very different from a flying genetically engineered organism that breeds and moves. So this isn't just about mosquitoes, but this is also about potential agricultural insects that this company is trying to develop as well. So currently, we need the Department of Pesticide Regulation in California to say no, to deny the permit to release genetically engineered mosquitoes. And we need that permit to be denied because there are too many risks and very little data suggesting this would work. But the risks and the uncertainty and the information that we do have suggesting the public health and environmental problems is too high right now, and we don't need it. Right, there are other ways to control mosquito-borne diseases that are much more effective, that are supported by communities, and that don't risk public health and the environment.
Yeah, one of our commenters said, "How about more bats?" So it's like you have a healthy functioning ecosystem, things are going to stay in balance. And then once you don't, things get weird, but it makes sense to work on having a healthy ecosystem. One of our other friends from the GMO movement, Rachel Linden, I'm really glad to have you here, Rachel. Her comment was, how many millions were spent on this dodgy scheme? And then I think she added that to millions or billions. So I haven't looked into this myself. Have you, Dana? Do you know if Oxitec gets federal grants to do this type of work?
There's a lot of questions about where the money comes from. It's a biotech company, and so they get a lot of investor money, but there have been questions about whether some of that money is coming from the Gates Foundation, for example. There's been, they get a lot of funding. I think that the state of California wouldn't have to pay for the trials, right? This is under the guise of an experiment. The problem with this is that once you release these genetically engineered mosquitoes into the environment, and if and when they breed with wild mosquitoes, there's no recalling. You can't say, oh, that mosquito experiment didn't go well, let's clean it up and let's not release it into the environment. Once it's out, it's out. And so it's really important that we actually do far more due diligence, that we use a precautionary approach with all of the data raising red flags. Let's stop and actually look at, is this necessary? No. Is this actually prudent? No. Is this responsible? No. We need to have regulations in place. We need to have transparent data. We need to have independent science and not just be listening only to what Oxitec is promising without any backup data. And community members need to be able to opt out, which they can't. And when it's to the tune of billions of mosquitoes being released into the environment, this is more than just a field trial.
Yeah, this is really good information, Dana, and such an important topic. But our friend John Rulak is here, and he had a really good comment too, taking us back to our earlier conversation. Oh, the irony that the woke city Berkeley opening up the red carpet to Bayer, the same company that poisoned and killed millions of people in World War II. And I wanted to mention or pick up on something you mentioned earlier, Dana. You said that Bayer had already been involved in eugenics and had actually apologized for their.
This Bayer wasn't necessarily, but the city of Berkeley had apologized, or California. I'm so sorry. Okay. California had apologized for the role that it had played in eugenics, and so I think that UC Berkeley has said that. I'm a little bit uncertain as to when this happened and exactly what was said. This is outside of my realm of expertise on genetic engineering. I'm not an expert in eugenics, but there was recognition about some of the dangers related to eugenics. And now with this new generation of genetic engineered tools being mixed in pharmaceuticals, we really need to make sure that there's not a red line, that there's no crossing of this red line moving into the genetic engineering of humans, which moves us into a new generation of techno-eugenics. And speaking to John's comment, there is a lot of irony in that there's a company that there's clear data about the pesticides and chemicals that have had incredible damage, lies, accidents, breaches of biosafety. And so you have this company with a history of horrific biolab practices now telling the city of Berkeley that it follows all the protocols, that it can be trusted, they don't need to report anything. And we need to remember history. We need to have all of these experiments, these proposals with the mosquitoes. We need to have all of this in the context of history so that we don't keep repeating our same mistakes over and over again. We have lots of examples of genetically engineered invasive species that are designed to address another invasive species. And more often than not, it creates a whole next level of problems. We've seen this play out many times, and it is likely that this will be the same problem with Oxitec. We need to see data, we need regulations, we need to have experts be looking at this, we need to have community opt-in, opt-out. And we need to actually look at what's needed. Is this just another biotech party trick looking to, find a profit? Or are there actually ways to address mosquito-borne diseases that get to the root problem, that are community-driven, and that are safe for people and the environment?
Yeah, so when you referred to the apology from California, that was related to policies of sterilization of people of color, poor people, disabled people. There was a really good documentary that Andy Kimbrell of the Center for Food Safety produced about eugenics that covers all of this. But yeah, I mean, we've had, obviously bad things happen before. And then John's comment about World War II is referring to the military history of Bayer that goes back to the Third Reich and IG Farben. And I'll leave it to folks in the chat to get into that as deeply as you want to, but it's a little bit outside of our expertise and our topic here. So taking it back now to the mosquitoes, all these, yeah, everything that you've said makes total sense. Like a community should be able to, it shouldn't be like the federal government, the EPA, and a corporation and private funders like Bill Gates getting to decide what happens in your community. It should be your community that decides whether they want GMO mosquitoes released, if they want to be part of one of these experiments. Have there been communities that have tried to figure out a way to stand up to the federal government? I guess, you said that they're doing this on the Keys right now and in California, but I guess it was California that you said that there was more, a little bit more community organizing around this, or both places are?
Both places.
Yeah.
The Florida Keys has been organizing against the release of the genetically engineered mosquito, I believe since 2012. And it was the first time the mosquito, a genetically engineered insect really, en masse was released in the United States. And that at first was like won the campaign to block any release of genetically engineered mosquitoes. They were very organized in Florida, and the first time around they blocked it. Oxitec went back, developed a different version, and then the second version, despite the very, very strong opposition in Florida, was approved by the EPA and then rubber stamped by the State Department of Food and Ag and Consumer Services in Florida. So this was in the face of a lot of community opposition. In California, there was no naming of where the release was being proposed until after the EPA approved it. So there was a permit applied to the federal EPA. They said, 12 counties across California. That's huge. that could be anywhere in California. The EPA approved it. It wasn't until later, when the company then applied separately to California, that we learned Tulare County was going to be one of the primary focuses. At this point, most people in Tulare County still don't know that there's a proposal for the release of GE mosquitoes. People are just learning about it, but the Department of Pesticide Regulation has done very little outreach. The only entity that seems to be doing outreach is local community organizations, and then, of course, the company itself is doing its own company-driven outreach. And so what we need right now is for people to be contacting the Department of Pesticide Regulations. And there's a petition that we continue to send each person. Every time you sign the petition, it goes straight to the Department of Pesticide Regulation. The petition can be found at nogemosquitoes.org. And it's to say that the DPR, which is a department under the Cal EPA, needs to say no to this permit, deny this permit to release billions of genetically engineered mosquitoes into California. And it goes into details why. What are the very specific public health risks that we're concerned about? What are the environmental concerns? What are the regulatory needs? It's very clear that this is inappropriate. It's unnecessary. It shouldn't be happening before we have any sort of guardrails or regulations. We need to have independent data so that it's not just being corporate driven. It's a very clear-cut example of what we should not be doing. And as a state that is able to say no to the federal government's suggestion or their own approval, we need to be leading. California needs to lead in this case.
Thinking about Florida activists who fought this, I was reminded of what I had heard about a woman from Florida who had been fighting the GMO mosquitoes, who had come here to Washington, D.C. to campaign and died in her hotel in the swimming pool. Did you know Mila DeMayer?
I did know Mila. Mila is one of the fiercest activists. She was a real estate agent in Florida, in the Florida Keys, and was an amazing community organizer who cares about her family. She cares about her kids, cares about her neighbors, and went door to door, knocking on everybody's door, letting people know, here's what we're concerned about, and educating the community about the risks. And she had 200,000, I believe, signatures on a public petition that she was going to DC to deliver to the federal government. And I believe it was the morning that she was going to go. She was found dead, as you said, in the swimming pool of her hotel. And so it was really unfortunate. There's many activists in Florida and in the Florida Keys, and Mila was definitely one of the beating hearts of that community. And the community fights on, both because they care about the issue and also in memory of Mila and the fuel that she provided and the love for her community and environment that she was herself fueled by. And that's the sort of passion that we're also already seeing in California as people learn about the potential release and the concerns, and that it's not needed, and the lack of any sort of safety, that the company itself would be doing its own monitoring. Like, we've learned that companies shouldn't be doing their own monitoring. There should at least be an independent entity checking to see what's happening. So we're just really, this GE mosquito proposal is all the worst practices that we should be learning from, seeing how these play out in the past. We just need to say no to this genetically engineered mosquito project. DPR needs to say no. They need to deny the permit. And we need to be leaning into best practices to protect people and our ecosystems.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for leading the charge in California. And I hope everyone listening who's in California will get involved and contact your elected officials locally and get involved through Friends of the Earth. So Dana, while I have you, and maybe you can spend 15 more minutes with me, I would love to hear more about your long-standing campaign at Friends of the Earth on synthetic biology, which is just a whole new realm of GMOs. How would you describe synthetic biology versus a GMO?
Yeah, genetically modified organisms is an old way to describe how we used to do genetic engineering, using just maybe one or two techniques. And now genetic engineering involves a whole suite of different techniques, including gene editing. Some people know the term CRISPR. CRISPR is a type of gene editing. There's gene silencing technologies using RNAi, which is RNA interference. There's just a whole catalog full of different ways that researchers are doing genetic engineering. It's all part of it's all genetic engineering, right? And so many of the concerns that we have about the unintended consequences, the on-target effects, the off-target effects, the ripple effects across DNA, and the problems with the traits gone poorly are all the same sort of concerns that we have. But the difference is, like with a GMO, maybe the final product is itself the thing that was genetically engineered. So, eating a genetically engineered corn, where the DNA of that actual organism was the thing that was altered. But now there are some scientists who are focused on genetically engineering the process. So, for example, you could genetically engineer yeast, and in a process of fermentation, rather than excreting out something that we would see as like beer or wine, maybe the yeast would be designed to pump out vanilla, or the heme that's used in the Impossible Burger, right? And so the final product, the vanilla itself, wasn't necessarily genetically engineered, but it's a process of it. So this doesn't exist, right? This is what I'm about to say doesn't exist. It's like you were to engineer a cow and then try not to tell us that the milk from that cow is, from a genetically engineered cow. I'd want to know. If a cow was genetically engineered, I want to know if those products are from a genetically engineered cow or if they were from a conventionally bred cow, right? The two are different. And in this instance, the federal government is claiming that new genetic engineering technologies may not need to be assessed as much, may not need to be labeled, may not need to be monitored, that they're different from traditional GMOs, but it's all genetic engineering. And we take a very strong position that all genetic engineering, the processes and the products and the organisms derived from it, all of it needs to be monitored. It needs to be assessed, and not voluntary assessments, but mandatory assessments for both public health as well as environment. And we need to have also transparency in labeling. So we need to not be making a distinction between genetic engineering. Is it a GMO? Is it gene edited? Is it made in this way or that way, using talons or zinc fingers? Whatever it is, it's all genetic engineering. It runs all the same risks. And we need to have safety measures in place to protect both consumers eating the genetically engineered products, as well as the environment. Worker health and safety is incredibly important. So there's a whole spread. It's I would just say that now it's not just genetically engineered corn and soy and plants. Now we're looking at genetically engineered animals like salmon or cows and pigs. There's still genetically engineered soy, and now there's a genetically engineered wheat. There's genetically engineered mosquitoes and insects. There's proposals to genetically engineer soil. So really there's this whole new generation of scientists who are trying to basically engineer all the different facets of life. And we need to be very careful, and we need to use the precautionary principle, which says, that we need to make sure that there aren't going to be a number of risks and uncertainty. We need to, rather than pushing something out on the market and waiting to see if there are detrimental risks, we need to first make sure that there isn't going to be undue harm to people, animals, and our environment.
Yeah, definitely. Rachel Linden here on the Facebook chat mentioned a really good book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth. And that book explains how when the first GMO was um, about to go onto the market in the United States, regulators went through normal safety testing. They did animal studies. They looked at how animals eating the GMO tomato were impacted. They found damage to the animal's major organs. And at that point, they said, maybe we have a better way to regulate this. And that's basically the story behind how GMOs came to be considered generally recognized as safe. And apparently, that's also what's happening with some of these 100% synthetic, I guess I couldn't call them foods, but ingredients, components of things that are presented as edible. The genetically engineered heme was also considered grass. The Center for Food Safety has had that in litigation. I'm not sure if there are any updates since I last looked at the litigation, but can you tell us a little bit about this? Is how like even these like super 100% synthetic things are considered grass somehow, generally recognized
Yeah.
as if they're just normal?
It was pretty devastating. Most organisms derived or products derived from genetic engineering have a voluntary safety assessment process through what you named the generally recognized as safe. And in the case of the Impossible Burgers ingredient that they were promoting, the heme, it was a protein derived from genetically engineered yeast. And this product has not been in the human diet before. It was not an exact replica of the protein found in the soy root. And that protein found in the soy root is not in the human diet generally. So this was something that really should have been assessed for allergenicity. There were a number of red flags raised about health impacts based on some rat studies that were done, but which scientists and health experts looked at and said these are causes for concern. We want more data on this, and that data wasn't delivered. Not only was the data on the protein that has not been part of the human diet not assessed for complete safety, but also in the process of producing this protein, a whole bunch of other proteins, I think there were number 42 or 46 other unknown proteins were also produced. And there were not safety assessments done on all of those other proteins. And so there really is this question of trusting the company to say whether their product is safe or not, which history has shown us again and again, not just with food, but also with fossil fuel industry and animals. Like, we need to have independent assessment and we need strict regulations. It should not be a voluntary assessment, particularly for a product that has not been in the human diet before, particularly when other scientists have pointed out very concrete red flags that need further research. We should be making sure that food is safe before it ends up on people's plates, as opposed to afterwards. I think there's also questions about the fact that the Impossible Burger is just very, very highly processed. And so there's this dynamic that the company tries to set up between factory farmed cows or the Impossible Burger, but that's a false dynamic. It's a false binary choice. It leaves out organic, plant-based, truly plant-based burgers. It leaves out regenerative ag and pasture-based organic meat. Like, it leaves out the whole spectrum that is actually climate friendly, is actually more healthy for the body and for the environment. So we need to be careful to not get sucked into this PR of this snake oil of, the dual, the battle between the worst possible options, when there are safe and healthy options that are good for people and our ecosystems.
Yeah, definitely. There are plenty of certified organic vegan foods available. Like it's just so amazing that, yeah. And crazily enough, Impossible Burger has even gone after the best regenerative, organic, grass-fed producers of meat, acting like they're a problem when that way of farming is actually good for the environment. So I don't think that they're very genuine in either direction. I don't think they really care about veganism or saving the planet through, or climate, or, they don't care. They just want to get us all to eat 3D printed food, probably. Yeah, because they want to control the whole supply chain. And if something is natural and we can grow it ourselves in our backyards, then they can't control it. So, and they can't sell it to us. So they need to figure out new ways to create stuff that they can sell. I am curious, Dana, what you think the very most disgusting is it the Impossible Burger? What's your least favorite syn bio substance that's being promoted as edible? You're still muted.
Apologies. I think it's not just about the actual food, but the company and the lies that they spin that is the most disgusting part for me, because there's a lot of food, including food that is, not genetically engineered, but highly processed, conventional, and, just very full of chemicals, that I think is gross. But I think what's most gross is when a company very deliberately is trying to hide what they're doing, that they're not saying this is genetically engineered. They're using terms like plant-based or nature, bio-based, nature-derived. Just a lot of money is being spent to lie to the consumer, when consumers have been clear that we care about our health, we care about the environment, we care about transparency. And that, to me, is disgusting, when a company very intentionally not only is deceiving to consumers, but then also is very intentionally evading sound science, is evading regulations, is really shooting for the bottom line, and instead of stepping in a value-based, ethical, transparent, and using the best possible and best available sound science. And so in that case, I think Impossible Burger is one of the companies that is most angering for me.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. So what are Friends of the Earth's latest campaigns in the syn bio realm?
Yeah, there's many. We're working at the United Nations to try and get international guidelines and rules around synthetic biology and new genetic engineering techniques. We're still working to get regulations on GE animals. Right now, there really aren't regulations at all. There's kind of very loose old guidelines, but no regulations for genetically engineered animals, including salmon and cows and pigs, which have now been approved. Working on fighting against the genetically engineered mosquito in California and Florida, and working to address the new generation of genetically engineered pesticides that are coming out, at least out for patents and looking for approval. Gene silencing pesticide sprays, genetically engineered insects. So really, Friends of the Earth is trying to look 5 feet ahead of us, or a couple years ahead, tracking what's being proposed and giving us all the option to say, yes, that's a great idea, it's going to be good for our planet, good for people, or to say, no, actually, that's the wrong direction. That further perpetuates the agricultural, industrial, chemical-heavy treadmill that we're stuck on and trying to get off. So our campaigns are trying to allow us transparency, trying to daylight the data that we have and don't have, and to give us all options to which direction do we want to take this world that we all collectively live in.
Beautiful. Well, I encourage everybody to check out Friends of the Earth. You'll have a really easy to follow campaign page with lots of good links, lots of great reports you've done on SynBio, the genetically engineered mosquito, ways to take action. So yeah, go check that out. And if you're here on Facebook, you can find Friends of the Earth there as well, of course. Any other places we should direct folks to, Dana?
There's a lot of groups who we're working with, and so on Friends of the Earth's webpage, that you can find out other people who are working on these campaigns. You mentioned a few. Center for Food Safety is working on them, and US Right to Know is working on some of these. There's a lot of groups in Florida and California. So it really takes a movement. And I think the other thing to say is it actually takes all of us as individuals. So if any of this information resonates, if any of this strikes you in terms of your values, we do actually need to have individuals send in public comments, make phone calls, post on social media, right? We all need to be doing our part to make everything that we know transparent. So it's not just the individual organizations, but each of us individually that actually helps makes things out in public, and so that we can have it back in our control.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dana, for being here with us for the hour. Thanks to everybody who was listening and watching and writing in comments in the Facebook chat. This was a really fun Facebook for me. It was really nice to see Rachel Linden, John Rulak, and others in the chat. These are heroes of the GMO movement that you're chatting with. I want you to know. So yeah, so stay involved, and we'll be back here at Millions Against Monsanto on Facebook and on our Rockfin channel. And we've got lots more on our Rockfin channel, so please check us out there. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.